I'm Susan Jakes. I am the editor of ChinaFile, which is an online magazine about China published by the Asia Society. And we are here at the Kennedy Center tonight at the invitation of our Asia Society colleagues, most especially Orville Schell, who is ChinaFile's publisher, and who also, along with his co-curators, Susan Meiselas and Jeroen de Vries, conceived and produced this spectacular exhibit that's all around us, and all of the programming that is accompanying it over the next few days. So we're here tonight not to talk about China, at least not specifically, but to talk about the particular challenge that the climate crisis poses for writers who are trying to write about the climate crisis. How does a writer approach a topic so vast that is at once, or can feel like it's at once everywhere and nowhere in our past and in our future, and kind of bring some sort of discursive clarity and order to it in a way that makes it more possible for our frail human consciousness to comprehend and maybe even to act on. One of the great things about having the three writers sitting next to me here to chew this over is that they've all written about the climate crisis recently, and while they've done so from very different vantage points, pieces of the stories that they tell overlap in ways that I think really illuminate a lot of the questions that we're going to try to puzzle through tonight. So, to my far right, Aryn Baker is a longtime international correspondent for Time magazine, and she is the magazine's international environmental and climate correspondent. She's now based in Rome, but she roves globally to cover mostly the human impacts of climate change, particularly in the areas of food and agriculture. Aryn has reported for Time for the past 22 years. All right, we started at the same time, and she's done that while based in Hong Kong, Islamabad, New Delhi, Kabul, Beirut, and Cape Town, among other places that she traveled. And I should add that she had an accomplished career as a pastry chef before she got her start in journalism in Orville Schell's classroom at Berkeley. So this is a bit of a homecoming. To her left, Evan Osnos, who is a staff writer at The New Yorker, needs very little introduction in this town. He's the author of the National Book Award-winning Age of Ambition, which drew on his many years of reporting in China. He's also reported from Iraq and elsewhere in the Middle East, and from right here in Washington, D.C., since his return from China. His newest book, this is the newest, right? Okay.
It is.
Is called Wild Land, The Roots of the Making of America's Fury. And it draws on his early career writing from Clarksville, West Virginia, and Chicago, as well as more recent reporting around the country. And I happened to be reading Wild Land when one of my colleagues called to broach the subject of tonight's talk, and I was reading this especially devastating section of the book about the environmental impact of coal mining in West Virginia. And so I asked Evan if he would come and talk a little bit about that reporting and about his writing on the American politics of climate change over the past several years. And finally, last but not at all least, Alexandra Clemen is also an accomplished writer of nonfiction, but she's best known as the author of three dazzling works of fiction, Intimations, which is a collection of short stories, and two novels, You Too Can Have a Body Like Mine, and her most recent novel, which is called Something New Under the Sun, and which is a kind of parable about climate change and about America, largely set on Hollywood film lots and along freeways amid an apocalyptic drought in Los Angeles. And both in its substance and in its structure, this is a book that raises so many of the most essential questions about the difficulty of perceiving, absorbing, and comprehending what climate change means and kind of what to do with that knowledge. So although at times it's quite surreal and even somewhat hallucinatory, it makes a really ideal companion for Evan and Aryn's reporting. So the four of us are going to talk for the next 45 minutes or so, and then I'll open it up to you to ask questions. We're being recorded, and the video of this event will be available on the website of the Asia Society in the coming days. And just for those people who are going to be watching the video, I just want to note that, you know, we're having this conversation tonight from inside, literally, an effort to transmit awareness and maybe even comprehension of climate change while eschewing the written word altogether, and, you know, sort of getting to us through a sort of sensory channel that maybe reaches us in places that words can't. And so that lends a degree of friction to our discussion, and I think makes it an especially stimulating environment in which to be having it. So I want to start just very simply by asking each of you, and we can go in this order, I guess, you know, when did you first, are you aware of when you first started writing about climate change? And, you know, you all write about many different subjects, but what kinds of special demands does this subject place on you as a writer?
I was covering Africa, had been covering Africa since 2014. And towards the end of my time there, my stories got more and more about climate migration, drought in the Sahel, conflict that was caused because of access or inadequate access to resources. It just started creeping in. Climate was everywhere. And then I was living in Cape Town in 2016 and 17 when we had our first major drought. We're the first major city in the world that was faced with going down to day zero, which was the day when the taps would run dry. So then it became very personal, living in a city where each family was given a limit of 5 gallons of water a day for everything. And I started writing about that. And from there, I became personally attuned to the climate angle of everything I covered, and it just kept going.
And how did you feel like it was somehow different from writing about other subjects, or?
No, I mean, climate change and its impact on people is impactful as conflict or the other upsets that mark human lives, which is what I cover. So it was just adding to one more way of telling stories about how people live in the world today.
Yeah, I have to say, before answering that good question, it is also just sitting here is really a humbling moment as a writer to look at these images around us. It is kind of proof of concept of this extraordinary exhibition to just see the way in which these images have this way that is really beyond words. And I just am reminded again, having seen this exhibit for the first time 10 years ago, just what an awesome achievement it is. And I'm really honored to be a part of that. You know, there's a real resonance with what Aryn was just describing about seeing in Africa the ways in which climate was this almost ambient force on the politics, and it was shaping conflict and shaping people's politics and shaping the way the world was organized. And I was living in China and was seeing climate from this other point on this spectrum of human experience, which was the way in which China's industrial engine, this maw of resources, was beginning to change the world. I'm just thinking about the jet overhead that is also an ingredient in climate change. But the thing that was really powerful was, I remember the very first piece that I wrote about climate change. Actually, we were still calling it global warming in that way, and it was in Papua New Guinea. And I went down there as a reporter, and just a small trivia fact that's kind of interesting. I was a newspaper reporter, and the photographer I was working with was a guy named Pete Souza, who then went on and became President Obama's photographer and became very well known. And we had this extraordinary experience in Papua New Guinea where we were there for a story about the environment, but actually the piece about climate change that was really searing was a small story we did about a village of 400 people that had no electricity to speak of. It was a day's walk from an air conditioner or from power lines or any of the origins of climate change, and it was vanishing. And that's become now a kind of feature of how we talk about climate change, is places that are disappearing. But this was the first time that I was beginning to reckon with what that meant and what the forces that it exerted on people's minds were, because it was changing the way that a place lived when it felt like it had an expiration date. And so I wrote that story, and it was the beginning of this process of trying to reckon with what happens when we are aware of the sort of liquefaction of not just our place, but our society, and what makes us a functioning political place.
I love hearing how both of you came to.
Oh, hold on.
Yeah.
Can we have a mic? Okay, try again.
Hello?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Sorry, I have a very soft voice. I love hearing how both of you came upon climate change in the course of also reporting other things. It's impossible not to run into the phenomenon of climate change in your research. As a novelist, it's actually very easy to avoid talking about climate change. And I think an interesting exercise to do is to go novel by novel through your bookshelf and say, does climate change exist in this book? Does it exist in this book? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but how would you tell the difference? So when I decided I wanted to write a climate change novel, I knew I would have to come at it very purposefully. And it's intimidating because you're trying to throw a lasso around a phenomenon that is so vastly dispersed, that manifests in different, contradictory, opposite ways, and which exceeds sort of the view of any one individual. But the novel, for better or for worse, has traditionally been centered on individuals. So I played around with a couple of different ideas, but what I decided I wanted to focus in on was an area of climate change that was pretty particular to my own experience growing up in the West. So in Colorado, which is a place that's always in some degree or level of drought, and which honestly should probably look at itself and admit that it's a place of water scarcity rather than a place that experiences long droughts. And I moved it to California, similar sort of water system, and tried to tell a story that begins kind of in a regular character-centered world with motivations like improving one's life, making one's family happier, but eventually can't sort of resist the narrative that is increasing destabilization, increasing catastrophe, and a sort of catastrophe that interrupts our individual stories.
We're in a truly immersive exhibit here. Aryn, you now have this incredibly broad, and I would find it terribly daunting, remit of covering climate change globally. How do you think about how to prioritize, or how, which stories to tell?
I think I have on my laptop like a list of stories that need to be told. And what I do now is I start looking for the narratives that will be able to pull out or accentuate that story. So if I want to write about mangroves and the role they play in carbon sequestration, that's actually a kind of boring story. But if I can find a character or somebody in my other reading or reporting that all of a sudden can bring that to life, then I know I have issue A, character B, and I can put them together to tell a story that is actually meaningful as opposed to dutiful.
Well, so let's like stay on this subject a little bit, because I think what you said was quite interesting, which is that it sounds like what you're saying is you need a certain kind of delivery system for the information that you kind of already know exists to be absorbable. Is that how it works? How do you think about that?
I think so. I think also what Alexandra was saying is like, you want to tell a story, but people are not ready to just be told facts. They have to understand their role in the story or the meaning. What does it mean to them? Can they identify with somebody in the story? Everybody wants to hear their name. Well, everybody wants to see themselves in a story in some way or another, be it a novel, be it a nonfiction book, or be it a news about somewhere on the opposite side of the globe. So I think it's a way of attracting interest and attention through the individual, through the character, but also through the reader, drawing the reader in. I think that's important.
I mentioned to my 5-year-old daughter that I was going to be having this discussion the other day, and she just said, "Mama, could we please talk about something else, not climate change?" Which is a perfectly reasonable reaction. And I was thinking, when I open up the newspaper, look at the newspaper on my computer, and I see that there's a front page story about climate change, I don't want to read it. It's like the sun. If you look at it too directly, it burns your eyeballs out of your head. And this is in some ways a central theme of Alexandra's novel, the idea that there's some sort of continuum of consciousness of what is happening to the planet, that, at one pole is this kind of really destructive denial, and at the other end is like highly informed paralysis. And I'm really interested in how each of you think about how do you calibrate the information and the ideas that you're trying to transmit when you're writing about this subject in a way that allows people to not shut it out? Or do you even think that's your responsibility?
I think part of what's happening.
Sorry, wait, hold on.
I think part of what's hard about writing about climate is sort of the tyranny of distance, in the sense that people are often very far away, or they feel very far away from the actions that are either from the kind of actions that might solve it. So they don't feel as if they have control over the politics, or they feel as if, well, what's happening is very far away. It's a cyclone on the opposite side of the world, or it's a disappearing island in Papua New Guinea. And I think oftentimes one of the things that I keep returning to is that question of how do you remove that distance, and how do you get people to feel the immediacy of their own place in it, either their own agency or the effect on their own lives. And sometimes you kind of it was a story I wrote while living in China about very specifically like consumer things that you buy in this country, in the United States, that can have an effect on the opposite side of the world. And it was this process of establishing kind of, in Susie remembers we were living there at the same time, and I was interested in cashmere sweaters, and how cashmere sweaters, which were now available at Costco for $50 or something, the reason why they were available for a fraction of what they used to cost was because they were now being produced on this industrial scale up in the Alishan Plateau on the sort of Mongolian border. And so it was sort of, how do you get it into somebody's life in this visceral way? And one of the ways you do that is literature, which is a very different kind of delivery device. And in many ways, sort of the most powerful, I think.
Yeah. But there was a literary technique in that story, right? The reason I made that little sign was that Evan had this really indelible and apparently like completely memorable detail about how the grasslands in Mongolia, in Inner Mongolia, were getting people were grazing huge numbers of cashmere goats, and they used to graze camels, and the camels had sort of soft feet that would just kind of pad gently over the vegetation, and the cashmere goats had these very pointy stiletto-like heels that destroyed the vegetation, and then the dust cloud traveled across, right?
That's
traveled
totally
across
right. I'm
the
totally
ocean
impressed by your memory of- and then
to
the
California.
dust, you could actually measure that dust in San Francisco because it would go across the Pacific, and you could test the silicon and the actual chemical compound and tell that it came from this very specific piece on the Mongolian border. And that was very kind of, as a reader, it felt like I wanted to make it the kind of thing that you had to see your connection to it.
I love that. I need to read this article. I want to know all about the cashmere goats. But I also think what you get at is so true. Like, there's a way to make distant things feel immediate in writing that is a valuable political tool, I think, and a valuable way of accessing emotion, because facts are useful, but it's easy to get into fact overload and feel like there's nothing there for you to act on or feel for. The feeling you go into is one of sort of passivity. And so having a person who has a stake in it, or having a view of the situation that sort of we wouldn't normally be afforded because of where we're placed in the world or how much time we can spend in the place, I think really makes a difference.
I also think that having a solution or an agency, that instead of just pointing at a problem, being able to say this is happening, but here are ways around it. Here's what people are doing to combat it or to help mitigate some of the effects. And that helps it be less like, oh my God, I give up, and more like, okay, something can be done. We can tackle this.
But I wonder about that. I mean, is that corrupting of the truth in some way? Because I mean, we are now in a situation where even if we got to net zero emissions tomorrow, we would still be facing several decades of intense suffering and death. I mean, do we still talk about climate solutions? Not mitigation, maybe, right? But I mean, I don't know, what's the right balance of kind of, if you're thinking about trying to give people a sense of agency as a way to get them to absorb the more difficult information, how do you avoid running the risk of, creating a sort of mirage of hope that doesn't belong there?
We're not doomed yet. It is not all over. I mean,
do you see this?
Yes, but if you think about it, how much worse would it be if we didn't get to net zero in 8 years? If we just kept going on? I mean, we can at least slow things down. We can make it better than it would be that if we just kept going. So I think it's dangerous to say it's too late. It's dangerous to be a pessimist, because it's not true. There are things that can be done. Policy can be changed. Me not using a washing machine or a dryer is not going to change the world, but enough people paying enough attention, understanding more, and leading to policy change will make the difference that we need to see.
I'll let you respond to that as the roaring jet fuel.
I'll use that moment to appear very contemplative and thoughtful. But I think actually Aryn's onto something really important, which is, and this applies in politics more broadly, that it is tempting to say that, I mean, if you look at America's conditions, we'll just sort of broadly describe, if you look at things like income inequality, it is tempting to say, and to be fatalistic, and to say, I can't fix this. But in fact, there are ways in which, as an individual, either through activism or service or simply voting, that you do have agency. And I think part of the thing about good climate writing is that you do see a way in which people are seeing in their, I mean, I'll give you an example from outside climate, that, take somebody like Paul Farmer, who just died, who was, a revered physician, who was somebody who, in his work, he was written about this way, particularly Tracy Kidder wrote the book Mountains Beyond Mountains, which was in some ways kind of countercultural because, it wasn't about a conflict, it wasn't about somebody doing something scandalous, it was about somebody doing something good, and it was about mastery. And I've one of the things, my secret little mission in the next couple of years is that I want to write more about mastery, of people doing things really, really well. Because I think actually there is this hunger that people have for that, for being reminded that there is expertise and that there are things being done every day that are, and no, it doesn't solve the problem, but it is part of the process of addressing the problem.
You know, and I also add that as we're coming up with ways to adapt or ways to mitigate partial solutions to the problem, how we conceive of how we're connected to other people and how our specific version of climate change catastrophe is linked to theirs, even though it seems so disparate, has an effect on what sort of the justice of the situations that we come up with, the holisticness of those solutions. So that's one element. I hope to write a more optimistic book sometime, and that's something I'm currently putting some energy into trying to grow that skill in myself. But I also think that it's useful to build a catalog of affects and ways that we can feel about climate change, some of which are more hopeful, some of which are less hopeful, but all of which are different from the predominant sort of crushing feeling that you can feel sometimes. So we see ourselves better, I think, and we have a fuller understanding of how we're embedded in this situation when we can see all the different versions of doubt we have. The feeling one feeling I really wanted to get into this book was the feeling of being all right while being on a phone call with a loved one, friend, or family member who is inhabiting a catastrophe somewhere else. Like, that feeling is, you have sympathy, there's empathy, but it's hard to conjure like a sense of directness and reality behind that. You strain to do it, and I think that's one of the feelings that we have to learn to make sense of and form a reaction to, if possible. Yeah.
Which is, I mean, one of the things you're describing too is sort of what is the narrative function of empathy, and how do you deliver it, or how do you generate it in a way that's not mealy-mouthed, that's not, or that's not shaking your finger at somebody, but you want to. I mean, ultimately, that is the function of literature: is to imagine somebody in the shoes of another. And that feels extra important when we're talking about a global phenomenon that is being experienced in such radically different ways in different places.
What about for the two of you who are writing nonfiction? I mean, are you sort of consciously thinking about trying to elicit feelings of, I don't know, discomfort, guilt, hope in your readers as you're telling these stories?
I think I would avoid guilt because it shuts people down. But I hope I do try and engender hope, or at least identification or empathy. I think maybe empathy is more important, with an understanding of what how the actions of a reader in the United States, their life choices may or may not impact somebody suffering from drought in the Sahel, like trying to bring those connections together. And climate is actually a really good bridge for that, because it is actions happening in one part of the world that are impacting another part of the world. And if we can tease that out and make readers understand that a little bit better, I think there does bring more engagement and more awareness and more empathy, hopefully.
I think of it as sort of like playing different notes on a keyboard, that you try to do different things. Like, I remember once writing a piece for The New Yorker about, I basically tried to use America's competitiveness instinct by talking about all the things China was doing to address climate change. And I never really said in there, boy, we're really being left in the dust in the United States. But the whole implication was I wanted to get people feeling very sort of Sputnik moment about it. And, I think that's one thing you can, but you sort of have to you have to sort of sense, what is it that, something in the American character that we have these little access points. And so one of the things, I've written a bit about the idea of, call it what it is, billionaires preparing for the end of the world, and part of the idea of writing about that, of people going to New Zealand or building bunkers and so on, was I wanted to, in a subtle way, write about the differential effects of climate change and the intersection with politics. So that was appealing to a slightly different, maybe slightly less lofty American characteristic. But these are some of the notes that are available on
Alexandra
scale.
also has characters who are planning to hightail it to their bunker
It's an irresistible topic.
in New Zealand. And actually that brings me to a series of questions. I mean, those two characters at some point are, I don't think this is too much of a spoiler, but they're confronted with the knowledge that they are engaged in this really diabolical scheme that entails selling a substance that's kind of poisonous to people that they also need, and then also profiting from the medical effects of that substance. And when they're confronted with the possibility of having the scheme exposed, they basically say, well, go ahead and expose us, but people aren't going to be able to stop drinking. It's a commercial synthetic water product called water. They're not going to be able to stop drinking it anyway, and you're just going to make them suffer more. And I was thinking, Evan, about this same devastating chapter of your book about West Virginia, where you get to the point where there's this community that really does have a very clear picture of what has, environmentally and economically been wrought upon their, this devastation wrought on their community. And yet that knowledge doesn't really translate into any kind of power. I mean, it sort of upends this whole central tenet of what journalists think that they're doing by informing the public. And I just wonder how it feels to write that. Write that kind of a...
I mean, very specific, and I'd be curious what Alexandra's experience of this is. That, I mean, one of the things is writing about irrational behavior or irrational responses. That, I mean, West Virginia, which is a place I care a lot about, I worked there as a young reporter, and I've sort of gone back over the years and written about it. Sometimes people will look at it and say, why are people in West Virginia voting against taking action on climate change? You can see the effect. They're getting 100-year floods now every few years, and they're getting very clearly the effect. And the point is not mysterious. It's that the whole culture is integrated with the coal economy. And I think what it sort of leads me to is this way in which these decisions, these choices, are completely inextricably bound with culture and who we define ourselves as individuals. And if you go to West Virginia and you ask people what percent, and I had this experience, you ask people what percentage of your economy do you think relies on the coal industry, how many people are employed, they'll say, well, maybe it's down to 20%. And the real answer is it's 2%. But the self-identity, the self-narrative is too hard to give up. But I think that's sort of part of why I'm intrigued by the idea of how do you write about climate change as fiction and getting at those seams in the culture, and where can you pry them open and kind of play?
I mean, without reporting on the fact that 2% of the population is working in the coal industry, the idea just perpetuates that this is fundamentally a coal mining place. Like, I think that to shift the way that we see the world, to update it according to the most current data that we have, that's a valuable first step in getting people to absorb and integrate that information differently. One thing that I think is happening a lot in fiction nowadays is that we're finding the boundary between speculative fiction, science fiction, and more realist literary fiction blurred. We are living in a world that has science fictional elements. We're living in a world that feels more futuristic than it used to, and we have to, in some sense, shift out of a genre of writing that was the realist novel, where things are pretty stable in the background and we watch people move around and change and interact in the foreground, to one where everything is moving suddenly, and you're world building and you're adjusting to that world building, and you're kind of doing it all at once.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't really plan for this, but there's some of the more surreal science fiction-like elements of your book. turn out to be things that appear in real life in Aryn and Evan's reporting. There are several scenes in landscapes where there's kind of this very alien form of vegetation that has taken over from the familiar plants, and that's something that's in your reporting from West Virginia, and the sort of central plot line about Angelenos needing to drink this synthetic liquid called Wat-R, which is described as being the same as water, just a little bit more so. Aryn has just come from reporting on the production of synthetic, is it called synthetic? Or
No.
Man-made meat and milk. And how do you, in Alexandra's novel, this product is quite a sinister thing, but how do you think about exposing people to things that feel to them like science fiction in a way that might cause them to be a bit more welcoming of these things that might be climate change mitigating products?
I think Alexandra's novel is very good for reminding us that we should not just wholeheartedly embrace technology. Just because someone promises a solution, we should still question it. But I think it's also a truth that technology will and must have a role in how we deal with climate change going forward, both in how we stop it, but how we deal with it, and we will have to deal with it. And it will probably require sacrifices, compromises, and taking on new, questionable, unfamiliar products or lifestyles that we have to be open to. And so it's novels that maybe introduce us to the unfamiliar and the ideas, but also warn us how it can be used as a force for evil as much as for good.
Aryn, you're the first person I've met who's tasted synthetic milk and synthetic meat. I've read about it, but I haven't known anyone. Is it lonely to be the only person who's done that? And how do you convey the experience to other people who have no basis for sharing it?
I've never thought about it as being lonely. It's more like I want to tell everyone, I just tried this thing that nobody else has tried, and it tastes exactly like the same as the original, except it's just grown in a laboratory. This is meat that's grown from stem cells. I think it's an opportunity to tell a bigger story. In this case, I'm not just talking about the technology, but I'm talking about the reason why we need to have meat grown from stem cells inside of a laboratory instead of cows is because of the destructive nature of the industrial animal agricultural, the animal agriculture industry that is incompatible with a planet that stays cool. So it's a way of, again, bringing attention. Here's this new technology that may be scary, may be interesting, may be intriguing, and the reason why we need it is because of what's going on with the way we eat today and how that needs to change. So it's a way of, again, bringing readers in, maybe slipping in that climate change narrative where they're not paying attention, but to keep it into the daily narrative.
Alexandra, there's a section of your book in which there's a group of people who have left their urban lives to kind of live more intentionally in a kind of camp-like setting in the woods. And one of the things that they do there is have a daily meeting where somebody delivers what's called the morning report, which is a kind of a list of all of the species and also man-made things and places that have become extinct the day before. And it has to be a curated list because there's so many things that they couldn't get to all of them every single day. And this list of things that's disappeared is delivered in this exquisitely poetic, highly attentive kind of language, which also appears in the book in the narrator's voice. There's like very, very close attention to the details of plants and the movements of animals. And I just wonder how you think about that. Like, is attentiveness to nature part of this? Well, I don't like to say solution, but like, is that going to advance our ability to confront this big emergency?
I think that attentiveness to nature has to be part of it, because even with an increase in wildfires and flooding and things like that, it's still possible to imagine that things are staying more or less the same. We're very bad at recognizing gradual changes in the environment around us. And it's only when you sort of impose sort of a temporal distance, for example, like hearing from a relative that 30 years ago there were this many birds, or there were this many insects, or the windshield used to be covered with insects when you drove down this road, that you can really see the difference. So we have that as one tool, but we also have as another tool, I think, just recognizing what we do have, and seeing our environment as a rich one that would be a loss, even if it were to degrade 10%, 20%. I think that it's also a feeling that's not fully positive, like I'm going to get out there and do something, but it increases agency, it increases a feeling of fullness in the world, and it is empowering, it's connecting in some way. So I think that there are more varieties of positive emotions than we strictly account for when we say, does this make us do something productive? There are other things that feed that desire to do something productive. Makes sense. Yeah. And, you know, in that sense, too, one thing that really struck me about the way you write about West Virginia, Evan, is that an irreplaceable moment for me was the one where you describe the new ecology that's taken root at the top of this mountain, and that it's foreign. It's like, it's not just unfamiliar plants, but it's like another place that's been transported there. And without seeing that, I don't feel like I get a picture of how truly strange it is, the type of work that's been done to that site.
Yeah, there is that. That is this very specific phenomenon there that birds that typically would never be found in the mountains of West Virginia or in Appalachia they think they're on the plains, they think they're on the Great Plains because these mountaintops have been removed. And so you get this really sort of lunar, and I mean that in the fullest sense, not just that it looks like it's all craters, but it really does feel sort of extraterrestrial. And that is, in some ways, that kind of gets to this underlying effect of climate change, which is this kind of sense of dislocation, where these places that we know become unrecognizable or become strange or become hostile to us. And I think that's part of what we're all trying to capture on some level but it happens slowly. And so we're sitting in front of such a great example of it. I mean, these are images of a glacier from a century ago, and then here they are today. And part of the reason to make it so, I think, so powerfully apparent is precisely that fact. We don't, I've been thinking a lot, as we've been talking about the opening question that you raised about how do you what are the tools that we use to get people to pay attention? And on some level, we've had all kinds of things. And there's the documentary approach, there's the feature film approach, there's the nonfiction approach, fiction approach. And it's not like there is one thing that's going to work. And one of the things you get here is that sense that sometimes you really have to go beyond the writer's ability, and you have to try to attack somebody's synapses from some new angle.
One thing that I really struck me about your novel, Alexandra, is that while it's in no sense uplifting, it's really quite bleak. there's a lot of humor in it, and then there is this, exquisite kind of lyricism that seems intended to, or at least it gives pleasure. And I wondered a little bit about that, how you thought about, like, do we need pleasurable things to is that like the sugar coating on the medicine, or how do you think about that relationship?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think a lot of the humor, I felt like I was explicitly building it in so that I could keep writing. So if you make yourself laugh every once in a while, you puncture this bubble of tension and distress that can build up. I think when you're imagining a world that it's fate, if you're the author, and it's not going to go so well. But I also think that, it's true that even these ecologically degraded spaces have a sort of poetry to them. They have a sort of beauty, and even connecting to that feeling, I feel is one that opens you up to the environment rather than closes you off in some way. Yeah.
Have you experienced that, Aryn? Oh, is it hard to hear? Just this feeling that there is somehow even beauty in the destruction. Is that true? Is that?
Yeah, I mean.
Or let me add on a question to that, which is, I mean, among the three of you, you are the one who's doing this topic day in and day out. How do you, how do you keep it going? How do you kind of take care of your own feelings about this? Do you need to do that?
Well, I mean, I think in this one I want to go back to Mr. Rogers when he was once asked, how do you help kids that are looking at a catastrophe, like an explosion or a train track? And his advice to the mother that was asking him was, look for the helpers. That's the kids need to look for the helpers. That's who I look for. Look for the helpers. That's what reminds me that it's not all downhill from here. That there's still hope. I need hope. Like, really, in my daily life, I need hope. So I cling to it, even if it's probably maybe built up a little more than it should be. I have to use that.
Well, that might be a perfect moment to invite up the central helper in our midst, Orville Schell, to maybe just talk a little bit about, how what we've said relates to this incredible project all around us. So, Orville, why don't you join us?
Well said.
And then we'll start taking some questions from all of you. So start thinking.
Well, it's nice to be here with you all, listening to you wax between hope and despair. I think the question we started with is an interesting one. How did each of us suddenly become aware there was a problem? And I mean, Susie asked me to think about that, and I remember vividly what that moment was for me. My kids were in school in China. We wanted to go up and see some Buddhist grottos up in Shanxi province in coal country. And I had these images of these sylvan grottos with these nice Pacific Buddhas staring out across some lovely landscape. Well, my moment on the road to Damascus came on the road to Datong, China, which is, if I had to just cut to the chase and describe it, it was hell on earth. I've never seen a place like this in my life. And the Buddhists, the grottos, the Buddhas were looking out across an immense rail yard filled with cars, filled with coal, coal mines ripping the mountains on all sides of it. And you just wondered, my God, is this a prefiguration of things to come? And it is. It was. And I came back from that thinking, coal. Look behind you, look around you. Yeah. That's how this started. Coal is at the heart of the matter. And strangely sitting here on this stage with you all in this lovely Kennedy Center on the sylvan banks of the Potomac River with all these jets and choppers going by, I feel like I'm some Buddhist staring out across the rail yard at the desecration in Datong, China. I mean, not that it's, you get my point. It's a bit of hope and a bit of despair there. So that was my moment, and ever since then, you see here, this is 10, 12 years later.
So Orville, as you just very ably demonstrated, you're not somebody who tends to have difficulty finding words to describe things, but how did you come to embrace this wordless approach to informing people about this crisis?
Well, you know, the way it sort of started, that I made a couple of films for PBS in Tibet with the guy who did all these mountainscapes. And we were sneaking around from monastery to monastery trying to, you know, talk about the challenges that Tibet was facing. And he was saying, you know, I've been up on he went up Everest 5 times. He said, and every time I go up, I see the glaciers falling. So that's how we began. He went back, and you can just see here, he got these photos from 1921 from the George Mallory expedition, and he went back it took him days to do this, to the right place where Mallory had stood, and he reshot the glacier. So you just see the glacier go down and these wipes here. And then I guess I felt as a writer, I didn't feel I could write about climate change anymore. Nobody was listening. I felt like I was, Evan, you'll know this, and Susie, or Aryn, there's an expression in Chinese to play a zither to a cow. And I thought, isn't there some other way to get into people's, you know, consciousness? And I thought, let's try it visually. And then Susan Mysalis, our good friend, who's a Magnum photographer, Susan, are you there? Yeah, there you are. We got cooking and went to China and started doing coal documentary photos, and we thought, let's try through images. So that's what you see around. I hope it has some effect, because God knows I don't know what else to do.
Can I say that Orville doesn't know this, but I've learned so much from Orville about how you think about telling a story like this. In the very specific sense that it's not one story, it's not one project or one thing. It's a marathon, and it's a vocation. I mean, you adopt this as your project, and here we are 10 years,
15
years, and still telling the story and coming up with new ways of doing it. And I think that is actually very inspiring as somebody who does creative work, to be reminded of that like, no, this is like adopting I don't want to say a kid, but maybe a pet, but it's something that you take on as a big part of your life, and then continues to be a work that draws you in and challenges you to be creative and to find ways of reaching people. And I think a lot of what we do, unfortunately, tends to be one-off, but this is a pretty great demonstration of why this works this way.
Well, one hopes, and all we can say is we certainly haven't come to the end of this road to Damascus.
Yeah.
No. Are there questions from any of you? If there are, you can just come up to one of these microphones and maybe just, take turns. So go first.
This is on? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Hi, my name is Lily. I write about climate change in China for a new publication called Grid here in DC. I have kind of a broad question, and it's for Evan and Aryn, about the particular challenges of writing about climate change in foreign places, in other countries. So, Evan, you talk about the issue of distance and abstraction in climate change, and of course, with international reporting, you have a whole other layer of abstraction and distance. And I was thinking about what you said, Aryn, about waiting for the right character to come along. Sometimes I worry that there's there are these stories that are so important, but there's never going to be the right character that's going to come along. There's these big sources of emissions in China, and they're just so abstract and so hard to connect with. So I guess the question is, are there topics, are there stories that are just not fit for reporting for a more general audience? So that's one part of the question. The other part is that when I think about writing about climate change, the idea is activating the reader to do something or care about it more. I think the difficulty with writing about a foreign place is that, particularly in the case of an authoritarian country like China, the person who you hope to be reading the article who's living in that country may not be able to do anything about that issue. So I'm just curious how you grapple with that in your own work in those countries.
It's a wonderful question.
I haven't covered China since 2004. But for your first question about are some stories just not fit for an audience, I don't think that is the case at all. Not every story obviously has a character or a narrative, but a lot of my work on a daily basis is reading big scientific research papers and trying to figure out a way to say what they mean and what they're about and what they've discovered to an audience that is not a scientist. And I think that's a very valuable service to provide, because nobody's going to read Nature or Nature Climate Change, or, they're just not. So it's a particular challenge to say, like, okay, what is it about this particular finding that's going to be engaging to an audience or relevant to an audience? So it's not finding the character in the story, but finding the reader in the story and figuring out how to bring it together there. So,
I also think if you sort of step outside the climate world, for example, there's one of the great practitioners who I think of a lot in trying to connect readers to a distant drama is Catherine Boo, who has written about a lot of different things. She's written about Louisiana, she's written about Washington, D.C., she's written perhaps most sort of memorably about a slum in Mumbai. And one of the things that she did is the reason it worked, and this is what Alexandra does, is you get people to care about it not because the reader really doesn't probably care that much at the beginning, or they don't know that they're going to care about the specific inhabitants of this slum in Mumbai, but it is rendered as life, and it is rendered with all of that sort of dignifying detail and all of the complexity, and it becomes a bit of Dickens and a bit of Jane Austen and a bit of all of the great literature. And you can do that in nonfiction if you just linger, if you stay and you go back and you go back and you go back and you talk to people beyond the point where they think they need to talk to you anymore. And Orwell knows this well. I mean, you can begin to get something like literature on the page, and there's just nobody better at it, I think, than Catherine Boo. So that would be if it was me, I would be reading her all the day long.
Although that is hard to do as a climate reporter on China based in Washington in the spring of 2002, but maybe soon.
Great. First, I want to say thank you so much for having this discussion. It was extremely thought-provoking, and there's a lot of golden nuggets in it that I plan to take back to my own work and incorporate into my own life, so thank you so much. I want to ask a question about misinformation. This discussion is actually really timely because I just finished reading a book that said that you can't fight misinformation. In this case, climate change isn't real, to we can't do anything about it, or it's just a small change, or it's natural, any of that, right? But this book said that you can't fight misinformation with facts. And I'm a scientist. And so it said that you have to have a stronger narrative than the land of opportunity, industry, coal, community, all of that. So if I could pick your brain, do you guys have a strategy on how to fight misinformation?
Panelists?
Do you have a thought?
I mean, it's funny to talk about this as someone who explicitly deals with fictions, not facts. And there are so many ways in which I have to stretch also what I know to be the case to try to reach into a near future and give a picture that is emotionally true and also is still maintaining a link to what is factual in the present. But I think like one of the key things for me is a particular affect also that surrounds misinformation, which is suspicion, which is sort of a closed offness to the people who one narrative would posit as victims and the other posit as fakers or something like that. And I think that when you tell a story that makes those individuals fuller characters, people who seem more real and more tangible than just the idea that this group of people are lying or are trying to manipulate you, you're entering a space where you can begin to correct for some of the paranoia and suspicion that misinformation breeds. I have tried to make it more of a project in my own life to continue conversations with people who are not on the same page as me in terms of climate change, even though it can be very frustrating and it certainly feels very tense. But in the elongated conversation, we can usually get to a slightly different place in terms of how they see it. And increasingly, I'm sharing a lot of experiences that I have with how places I'm connected to and love have changed, how many more fires there are in my home state than there ever used to be, and then finding more people with experiences of their own like that they want to share. And I think that letting someone know that you've encountered this makes it much harder to push back on it and say, well, you've also been manipulated by the news. No, we all have experiences that intersect with climate change now that we can draw on, that we relate to emotionally.
This brings up something that I wanted to ask as well, which is, sort of two questions. Having lived through the first question is having lived through the pandemic and seen the way that information about the pandemic was and wasn't digested, particularly in this country. I wonder if that does that change at all the way that you think about writing about climate, any of you? And then the sort of add-on question, this is mostly for you, Evan, is just, one of the ideas or one of the solutions to misinformation in the pandemic was that if the correct information was transmitted through a trusted source, a family doctor, somebody closer to the intended recipient, that it could be more effectively absorbed. And so I know, Evan, you think a lot about the media landscape in this country and the different roles that kind of a national media outlet like the one that you work for plays versus local news outlets.
Yeah.
Do you think there's kind of a place for more community delivery of information about climate change?
Yeah,
and Aryn, maybe you can talk about that in other parts of the world.
It's such actually, it really carries on from that last question in the sense that, misinformation feeds on the absence of trust. That's like the oxygen that feeds that particular inferno. And so one of the things we did learn, actually, the pandemic has taught us a lot about the distortion of information and why people still hold on to things that are not true and how that becomes braided into their sense of themselves and their resentments and so on. And it is completely true that it matters tremendously who the messenger is. And I think I tend to look at these issues as inseparable from the decline and fall of local news in many cases, because what you have if you take a community in West Virginia, if the local paper is drying up and going away, people spend more and more of their time on nationalized conversation, on national news. They will, almost literally spend more time watching Fox, but also just in a general sense, you're sort of lifted out of your community, and you stop seeing your neighbors as people who have this thicker connection with. And so I do sort of think of it in terms of if you want to get people to pay attention to something like climate and pull it out of that national political tribal entrenchment, that really does begin in having it be something that is perceived as of relevance to your neighbor, whoever you voted for president. that is oftentimes, like, if you can get people to break bread over that idea that they are joined by something larger than their suspicions of one another, then you actually can begin to pick that lock. And the data on that is kind of thrilling, actually. I mean, the sort of contact, the theory of contact, of getting people into a room with one another on a subject on which they actually do see something in common. I will belt up because I could go on forever. But Orville, I know you've probably thought about this too, and Aryn's encountered it.
I mean, it is a bit of a mystery, and I think it's compounded by the fact that we used to think that fake news or distortions, propaganda, was on the other side of the ideological divide. That was over there. The communists did it. The dictators did it. But we were science-based and free and clear, and now we find that we are as vulnerable as they are, and we haven't quite figured out why we are, because we don't have a state theoretically lying to us. So I think it's just a human propensity to, I mean, probably was ever this way, that the sycophants and distortions, if attached to a charismatic leader, will be believed.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we get some more questions. Yes.
I
Speak up.
Hello. When you were, Mr. Osnos, when you were covering West Virginia, and this is following up on the news coverage, are the locals, and especially the residents in West Virginia, aware of Joe Manchin's self-interest, his financial interest in the coal and other energy interests, and how that affects the environment in their state?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there is this awareness on, very often you would find, I talk to people who they could give me chapter and verse on the ways in which his family and he personally benefits from the status quo and from the endurance of the coal industry. And then in the next breath they would say, but I also don't want those liberals in Washington telling me what I can and can't do. And that's one of those kind of cognitive chasms that you get to, and you're like, I feel like I'm getting somewhere, and then poof, I can't quite get across it. And I think one of the things that drives home is how much this is wrapped around the axle of identity, and about feeling as if there is somebody who is caring for me. And I know that sounds abstract, but I mean, as we all think about our politics of the last 6 years, very often it comes back to that question of, okay, I know this guy's lying, I know that he's making this up, but in the end, he's on my side. And I think as you try to figure out how you get politics to change a little bit, it's about getting the ability to get people to feel as if you are on their side in that basic way, I suppose.
So Joe Manchin is following the Trump style of leadership, I guess.
I think he would actually welcome that description. I think so, actually. Yeah.
Let's take a couple more.
Sorry. Hi, so actually I work for a political democratic pay communications campaigns organization. So I guess I'm here because when we do copy and messaging and polling, obviously with campaigns, candidates or whatever, climate does pop up, and so does the environment. And so I guess when we write about it, it is obviously very different from when you guys write about it. Although, thank you, we do cite you guys. And I guess my question is, and it's kind of piggybacking off of a little bit of the misinformation question, or I guess everyone's kind of talking about what politics can do. I guess I'm wondering if you guys have anything that you think, this is obviously a political question, I apologize for that, I know you guys aren't biased, thing that we are maybe missing about moving people in our, like, the way we talk about this. Because obviously when we talk about it to inspire an action, which is to turn out voters. And then there's other ways to talk about climate too. So I guess this is a very open question. You guys also don't have to answer it if it makes you uncomfortable. But like, if there's anything you think that we're missing in terms of like how I'm going to openly say advertise about this when we include it in our comms.
There's sort of a related way on that. I mean, one of the things I've been thinking about, and I'm curious to ask Alexandra, and you got at this a bit, Susie, was the role of humor. Because humor is sort of this kind of magical ingredient when it comes to persuasion. You can get people to pay attention to you if you get them to, and I'm curious how you think about that and the role of, how do you get people to lean in and pay attention, and you achieve it?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it helps that the places where I riff the most in a humorous way are not grounded strictly in reality. They're based in, for example, like other slogans and mottos for this brand of synthetic water that are ridiculous, and that humor kind of creates its own moment where more people can laugh at that sentiment than if I think you were to extract the point of the joke and then and give it to people directly. So that's one thing that I think humor opens up in a discussion. But I also think that, at least speaking for my field, maybe there's a way it extends to nonfiction. I think it relates to what Aryn was talking about, to show models of people who are exerting agency, or coming up with a way to exist that can provide a model for others. And so in the literary world, I think we've been so hamstrung by writing dystopias. When you think of the future, the first thing you might think of is a dystopian novel or TV show. So are there other kinds of dystopian futures that have more collaborative, more communal elements? Like, are there ways that we can reorganize society that are better, at least in some ways, than the ways that we have? So a cautiously, critically utopian direction, maybe.
That's interesting. I like that idea.
Collaborative dystopia for
I like
your
it. I like
political
it. I'm sold.
message.
I'll read that novel.
Kim Stanley Robinson wrote The Ministry of the Future, which is profoundly a dystopian collaborative solution. So and humorous too.
I mean, I went back at one point, I got really interested in the history of dystopian and utopian visions, and they always go together. And we're sort of going through this period for all legitimate, obvious reasons where we're writing about dystopias, we're thinking about it. But I do sort of feel as if there is this like flip side of that. It doesn't need to be sort of Panglossian kind of, let's just bury our head in the sand and pretend it's all going to be great. But there is a way in which you can inspire people by imagining alternative realities. I'm sold. I like that.
Well, Evan, isn't that precisely what Xi Jinping wants to get his people to imagine, that they are in a rejuvenated utopia of a totally different set of values than those which we would generally subscribe to? But there it is. No one's written the novel. It's actually being acted out in reality.
We could take maybe two more.
J.P. Hogan. First thing is, I saw the national snow and ice data for the Arctic had it above average for January this year of the 30-year. But on the coal in China, how often were they opening up new coal plants while making the green energy products for the international market? Were they building coal plants to actually have the power to create the green energy for other people? And when the EU and USA started the cuts in 2006, I know years ago it got to be 10% of CO2 was cut. I don't know what the current number is. And so I was wondering, where does it stand on affecting the CO2 cuts? So in talking about the coal and with the mining, if we're doing green tech to replace this, that's rare earth mining. So are you going to go from coal desolation to rare earth desolation mining, and you're not changing the mining aspect of it?
Yeah, that kind of balance is something that you've been really thinking a lot about, Aryn.
I mean, how much time do you have? But, on the snow and ice data, yes, the numbers were slightly above average for the month of January, but on average, over the past 30 years, they're significantly down by about 40%. I mean, the Arctic is clearly warming at 4 times the rate of anywhere else on the planet. So I think it's very clear there that we do have a crisis in the Arctic, and one that will impact the rest of the planet. I mean, that is our global air conditioner, so to speak. On the mining, the coal versus rare earths versus the cobalt we need to power our electric vehicles, I think instead of having it one over the other, what we need to start thinking is, how do we do everything in a way that maximizes benefit for the planet? So how do we have a better, cleaner, more environmentally friendly way to mine lithium, cobalt, nickel in this current situation? And how do we minimize, as we transition away from coal, how do we minimize both the impacts on the environment and the impacts on jobs and the people that are losing those jobs? How do we transition workers and labor to work into a more green environment? These are questions that we need to start talking about now, not later, as we move forward in this.
Well said.
Hi. Thank you first for your beautiful words.
Gideon, let me just introduce you.
Sure.
Gideon is one of our great photographers, and if you look at the back of the room, he did those ones of people standing in water and floods. They're stunningly beautiful.
Okay. Thanks for that. So I'm a photographer, and I've, I suppose, dedicated a lot of my career to trying to document climate change and make it visual. And I spent a few hours this afternoon with Susan and Jeroen, who are the two other kind of curators and facilitators of this amazing exhibition, and we were grappling with a really difficult question. I'm not sure if we've found a solution, but I thought I'd throw the same question at you guys, which is, what do we want our audience to do? You know, we're trying to battle complacency and paralysis, and a lot of the audience knows about climate change. What is our call to action? What do we, you know, I mean, I don't know if you have a similar kind of thing. People read your books, read your articles. It's one thing to be informed, but what is the call to action? Where do you want your readers to go once they've put the book or the magazine down?
I might try to make all three of you answer that. So I think it's a very important question. If you're
yeah,
sorry, that sounded so dictatorial.
I love that question, and there are so many different things you want to do when you work on the project. But one of them for me was I really wanted the reader to take home this feeling that this fear of climate and climate catastrophe is always present, whether or not you're attending to it, and to feel encouraged to let it enter or change their personal sphere after they finish reading the book. And I know some of those ways, when we talk about individual responsibility, is a clever ploy by petroleum companies to make us feel like we're responsible for emissions and we're not doing a good enough job. Even changing habits that we think have to be ingrained, I think, shows us that the structure of our life is pliable. It can be changed in many different ways. It can be changed in a couple key ways in this season as you try to set your goals for the next year. And I think it's an act of mindfulness also that hopefully is a first step toward larger kinds of organization. I think private life sometimes feels static, and it feels like it's governed by these goals that are very personal and very individually centered, but we can let that outer spirit into that world and let it into our personal life in a deeper way, I think.
Yeah, I remember reading somewhere somebody said that the goal of good journalism or nonfiction should always be to have the reader say, how can this be? How can this be? And to be either appalled or staggered or amazed or impressed, but to come away and sort of begin to imagine that something is impossible to endure. And that's a slow process. This gets back to this observation about Orville's work and your work on this, which is, it is about acculturating people to the idea that something is not necessarily the way it has to be. And I will give you, one example of something that we're beginning to see just cracks around the edges in an encouraging way. I've been, anybody who moves back to the United States as an American becomes horrified by the reality of the world we live in and gun violence. And just in the last, and it is as an American, it's the thing you are most staggered by when you come home from having lived elsewhere in the world, and you say, how can this be that we are the only industrialized nation that has this kind of regular occurrence in our schools and so on? And if you look at the activities that have been happening, it's not like gun violence is by any means going away. In fact, the problem is as acute as it was even a few years ago. But there is action. If you look at just the court case in Connecticut recently, in which people began to push back on what had believed to be this essentially immovable wall set up by legislation around gun companies, you've seen, if you look at attitudes among young people, they look at it and they say, there's simply no way we're going to live in a world in which there are no universal background checks. So I think that is a process of this kind of accretion of examples of the belief that something must, it doesn't have to be this way. And that's what this work does. I think on each individual day, that's what you hope to give people a reminder of.
Yeah, and I think going back to Alexandra's novel, In the Morning of the Species That Keep Dying, it is a marker and a reminder of what is changing in a way that, were we not reminding people of what's happening, you could have the scenario of the frog in the slowly warming pot. I mean, at one point or another, you're just like, hey, jump, get out. Yeah. So maybe that is our job as well, or a warning.
Thank you so much for this conversation. Over the course of the night, we've talked a lot about identity and narratives and how people have adapted or rather failed to adapt. And that's kind of prompted two questions for me. And one of them is, as practitioners of various forms of art, how do you strive to create meaning or derive meaning for yourselves by reporting on these topics? And secondly, how have you encountered different cultures or individuals creating meaning from these catastrophic events?
That's a beautiful question.
You're the artist.
You are the artist. You're
the artist.
Yeah, it's a heavy responsibility.
And I think that sometimes we think about an effect that we'd like to create in the world through our art, but we also are making it for ourselves, and to either work through the emotional terrain of that problem, or to put what we see on the page so it feels concrete and so it feels recognizable to us. And I think that even when I'm writing about things that are very dark, there is a sort of relief in having articulated something about the way I feel about it. But what's been really nice in the last couple of years, even though it's been the pandemic and I've been further from basically everyone I care about, is it's opened up some time where I've started being able to engage virtually with other people who are writing about climate change, other writers, to start joining a New York version chapter of XR Writers Rebel, where we organized a reading series and workshop work that is related to the climate crisis. So I think that it can be very isolating also to feel like you're under the weight of your own individual worries about climate. Even if the problems are the same when they're shared with others, it feels very different, though, to share them with others. And it also builds a muscle that you can do something with, I think.
Susie, if I may, one of the reasons we're here at the Kennedy Center is because Michael Tilson Thomas, the conductor, got Jesus on climate change, and when he's going to be conducting the 50th anniversary concerts next week and the week after, and he said, and we did something in San Francisco together. He did Appalachian Spring by Aaron Copland, and we collaborated with the San Francisco Symphony. So that's why we are here. And I think we're also having a prize, three $15,000 prizes, which will be awarded next month for 3 young artists doing climate-related artworks. I think it is time to mobilize the arts, all of them, to issues like this. And that's sort of part of what we're trying to do here. But music, it can be done. Art, photography, you see it all around you. Dance. We had Peter Sellers, the opera director in San Francisco. Somehow he had interpreted Idomeneo by Mozart as a climate change opera. It's stunning the way he did it, and it's brilliant. And I won't get into the whole litany of it. And then we had this wonderful Chinese soprano who was singing Idomeneo, and Salzburg came and sang. This is maybe another way to do this. And we writers, I think, have hit our limit. We can write and write and write, and I don't know how much more good it's going to do. So I think we need to expand our horizons.
All right, one last one.
Hi, everyone. We've seen an ongoing trend of...
Hold on 1 second.
We've seen an ongoing trend of younger generations becoming more involved in climate change, and I wanted to ask, how has your delivery of your work and how have you guys adapted in reporting on climate change to attract a younger demographic? And how has emerging technologies like virtual reality, immersive reality, or different types of social media affected the way that you interact with a younger generation?
Go Greta. I mean, Greta really energized a generation in a way that has not been articulated before, and with her was a global population of young climate activists that finally stood up and said, like, this matters to us. And I think they're the ones that actually are impacted. And so their voice, when we talk about authenticity or misinformation, like that, the young generation is the one that's like, no, this is real for me, this is impacting my life. And I think that's what has resonance both for their audience in terms of their age, but also an older audience, and forcing them to wake up. Encouraging and opening up those voices, getting Vanessa Nakate to talk, to write. We've featured both of them and many, many more young climate activists in time. That's a kind of an ongoing, quarterly at this point, ambition of ours, is to feature these young activists, to get their voices out there. So I think that is a big part of it. I'll leave the social media and the interactive to the more visual sides of the artistic, but on writing, it's getting voices out.
Aryn, we have this play that was inspired by Greta Thunberg's words that Georgetown is going to put on here. I forget, anyone know what day it is? Anyway, it'll be right here. So tomorrow. Well, there you go.
I would just say, actually, it's actually less the young people that I think we need to reach on climate change. They're actually incredibly activated and thrilling and actually inspiring. I'm starting trying to think, how do we use things like the metaverse to get people my age? I'm 45. How do we get my people to pay attention better and to use these tools? I think that actually may be the more imposing challenge right now.
Thank you.
Well, you already have, but I will invite you again to join me in thanking Aryn Baker, Evan Osnos, and Alexandra Clemen, and thanking Orville for giving us the opportunity to have this discussion and to bear witness to what is now becoming his life's work.
Hear, hear.
So thanks.
Yeah.